Good afternoon. My name's Martine Croxall. Ordinarily, I'm a presenter with the BBC News Channel, but today I have the pleasure of moderating today's debate and welcoming you to the European Parliament UK Information Office. It's great to have such a good turnout, obviously reflects the interest in this subject today. Thank you. Each year, this office co-hosts a debate with the UCL European Institute to coincide with the awarding of the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. It's named after the Soviet scientist and dissident Andrei Sakharov. The award was created in 1988 to honour people and organisations defending human rights and fundamental freedoms. This year's winner is the Saudi Arabian blogger and activist Raif Badawi, who you may recall was sentenced to 10 years in prison and 1,000 lashes for insulting Islam. Now, our discussion in the Sakharov debate isn't always strictly linked to the achievements of or the field of the prize winner, and this year we've chosen to focus on another very topical issue, the refugee crisis. And the question posed is, too little compassion or too much? I must state, though, that the European Parliament UK Information Office is neutral on this subject, but of course MEPs necessarily express a range of views on migrants and refugees. If you'd like to tweet about this, and we would be very glad if you did, the Wi-Fi is Europe House, the password is EU London, and if you can use the hashtag Sakharov UK just to flag it up, that would be very helpful. There can have been few more emotive or divisive issues this year than the refugee crisis. With millions of people displaced by violence in their home countries, hundreds of thousands have fled to Europe to find safety. Perhaps if one image came to encapsulate their despair and the dangers they face, it was that photograph that we've all seen of Aylan Kurdi, the 3-year-old Syrian boy who drowned in the Mediterranean. Some EU member states, especially the smaller ones on the periphery of the bloc, have said that they've been overwhelmed by the numbers arriving. Some governments have put up border fences, while members of the public have turned out to welcome refugees disembarking at railway stations. But as we've seen in the past, compassion can become fatigued, and some commentators have warned of the risk of a populist backlash. So why have the responses been so varied? Who is winning the argument on whether or not we should help refugees? What do these divisions tell us about Europe's ability to act together effectively? And how does the treatment of refugees define the kind of continent that we wish to live in? Has this mass movement of people from other places, in fact, become the crisis of Europe? Or to discuss these issues, we're joined by 4 guest speakers. We'll hear from all of them individually, and then we'll have a group discussion. And then at the end, we'll leave 20 to 25 minutes for you to ask your questions. So fear not, you'll get your turn. James Carver, or Jim, as he prefers, is a UKIP MEP elected for the West Midlands in 2014. He sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee and is UKIP's Commonwealth spokesman. He served with both the Royal Marines Reserve and the Territorial Army. I was reading that Jim is the 4th generation to run his family's umbrella firm. And if you see a bookmaker's brolly at a UK racecourse...
Or Ireland.
Or Ireland, sorry. His chances are it'll be a Carver umbrella. Jim's website says he's hard-working, a small businessman who tends to support the underdog, and when confronted with bad luck or injustice, puts up a fight. Stephanie Boltson is the UK and Ireland correspondent for Welt and Welt am Sonntag. From 2009 to 2012, she was their Europe correspondent in Brussels, covering EU and NATO affairs. Prior to that, she was a foreign news reporter and editor for Die Welt in Berlin, covering issues including Eastern Europe, energy and energy policy. Stephanie studied modern history at the Universities of Cologne and Seville, and then trained at the Axel Springer Journalist School. George Letsas is Professor of the Philosophy of Law at the University College London. He's the author of, amongst many other things, a theory of interpretation of the European Convention on Human Rights. He's been published extensively on philosophy and interpretation of human rights and the legitimacy of the European Court of Human Rights. Professor Letsas is currently the co-director of the UCL Institute for Human Rights and co-editor of UCL's Crane Lecture Series in Jurisprudence, which is published by Oxford University Press. And Daniel Smilov is a comparative constitutional lawyer and political scientist. He's the programme director at the Centre for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and a visiting professor at the Central European University in Budapest and assistant professor of political theory at the Political Science Department at the University of Sofia. Don't know how he has time. He holds doctorates from the University of Oxford and the Central European University. Dr. Smilov's interests include legal theory, political parties, party funding and corruption. He's written and edited several books in addition to many articles in Bulgarian and international publications. I'm sure you'll agree that the panel's been very well put together for this particular debate. Let me begin with Daniel, if I may. Daniel, how do you think that European laws on asylum allow or encourage compassion towards refugees?
Let me start with a note on the title, actually, of the debate, compassion. I just wonder whether we should focus on an emotion, what compassion is. Because framing the debate in terms of emotions is a little bit dangerous. Compassion is the positive emotion, and this is good. But compassion also meets negative emotions, which are fears. And unfortunately, when fears meet compassions, normally what happens is that fears trump compassions. And we should be wary about this difficulty. And I see it in many countries, and especially in Eastern Europe. Yes, people, generally, they're good-hearted. They have these emotions of compassion, but they also have quite a lot of fears. And if we are left at this level of emotion, very often the negative side takes over. So I would prefer to frame the debate rather in terms of other concepts, like duties. For instance, do we have, as Europeans, a duty to help people in distress, people who really suffer in places in which war is raging? So first, do we have a moral duty? Do we have a legal duty to do this? And secondly, actually, my thesis will be that we do have both moral and legal duties to help such people. And then the next set of questions will be, if we agree, we might disagree on this, but if we agree that we do have such duties, then the second question will be how best to address them. And here comes actually the question of Europe. Is it best to address these duties one by one, country by country, or is it best to address them together as a European Union or as a polity? And my thesis here will be that the second option is better. Definitely, because, first, Europe, the European Union as a whole, it has the resources. Compared to the resources the European Union has, the problem with the refugees is quite tangible. And it's, to put it like that, we, as European Union, emphatically have the resources to tackle this problem. So the whole point is coordination, how to coordinate among ourselves. And here, and probably I'll end with that, linking to your first question, I think that, the European Union falls short in coordinating the efforts. We don't have enough instruments actually to come up with the proper response. We do have the resources, it's manageable, but due to lack of institutional solutions and due to lack of leadership, I would say, for the time being, this is not happening. But it's quite preventable, and it's a matter, again, of political will and some coordination.
Having established that we have a duty then, in your view, if it's not a compassionate one, it's one of policy, one of legislation. How does legislation or policy help us know when we've helped enough, when we've met our duty? Because we are hearing from certain places in the European Union, small towns, villages, that feel overwhelmed by the numbers of people they're expected to help.
Well, from my perspective, and actually I'm Bulgarian, I come from, well, the border with Turkey. So our immediate kind of experience with the refugee crisis is with, well, of course, people crossing from the Turkish border, some people coming from Greece, but very small quantities. The immediate concern for Bulgarians is that if countries like Turkey and Greece are destabilized by the huge numbers of people who are there, well, this might make the whole situation intractable. So you really don't need a country like Greece, which is getting out of control because of influx of people. And there are some dangers of such a development, because Greece, for instance, it has a huge maritime border, difficulties to control it for one reason or another. Well, people are getting in there, and the policy of the Greek government has been not to register them immediately, but somehow to hope that they're going to be, sent to Germany or some other places, which in fact makes the problem worse because more and more people come. In Turkey, the situation is a bit different. There are, again, millions of people there from Syria. Some of them are kept in camps close to the border. Many of them also, well, they simply cross different borders. But the whole point is that if all the European countries are left to react on their own, probably they're going to build walls around them. And this will, in fact, make the problem intractable in the first countries like Turkey, Greece, Italy, and so on. And eventually we will end up with a disaster. So this is, in terms of logistics and mechanics, how I see the crisis.
Thank you. Jim, while we're defining our terms, how clear is it who is a refugee, to whom we should either be extending compassion or showing duty?
I don't know how clear it is, and I think this is the biggest tragedy to come out of this whole crisis. And some may call it a refugee crisis, some may call it a migrant crisis, and you know that's a debate we can all have on a separate day in itself, which will probably go on far longer than this one. For example, you look at the Human Relief Foundation, a British Muslim charity based in Bradford, who've been doing a lot of work in one of the refugee, the illegal camps in Calais, colloquially referred to as the jungle, who are now saying that 80% of the people living within that camp aren't really refugees, they're economic migrants. So much so that, you know, they've actually been looking very closely at putting resources, you know, directly with refugee camps in Jordan and in other parts of the Middle East. And it's interesting that the Wall Street Journal yesterday was reporting that refugees were, you know, in refugees, migrants, whatever, within that camp were being resettled in other parts of France. And one reference I used was a gentleman originally from Syria who was relocated to south of France, and yet 3 days later was back at the jungle trying to get across the United Kingdom. So, and that to me is the biggest tragedy of this whole debate, is that how migration and asylum have been deliberately, I would say, by our political class, muddled up and been made the same thing. And you might think that's a surprising thing to come from someone like me, but you might be surprised to learn that I'm actually the grandson of a Polish Ashkenazi Jewish refugee who settled in this country after the turn of the century. I'm the only British elected parliamentarian from a Romani Gypsy background. I do a lot of work on Gypsy rights. And one thing that I find particularly upsetting is, with respect to you, the Bulgarian, certainly the Romanian and Bulgarian approach to how they deal with their own Roma communities. Colleagues of mine have visited large Roma camps in Bulgaria and in Romania. In fact, Nigel Farage visited one of the largest camps in Bulgaria only 3 or 4 years ago, and when he challenged a Bulgarian minister while he was there as to the situation, You know, he said, well, soon they won't be our problem, they'll be your problem. So until we can actually address the human rights implications of European citizens, actually within the borders of the European Union, we can't, with the best will in the world, hope to wave a magic wand and make the world right.
How, if at all, has the UKIP view of how we're supposed to cope with refugees from outside the EU borders, if we can just set those who are perhaps disenfranchised from within Europe, set those to one side for a sec.
But I'm just using that as an example to explain that, you know,
yes.
we must get our own house in order first.
I understand. How has the UKIP view, policy on how we're supposed to help these huge numbers of refugees from outside the EU changed over the course of time?
Martine, we're very clear. You know, we are an internationalist party. We believe, you know, I've explained, I'm a strong advocate of the Commonwealth. You know, we believe in playing our part in the wider world. And of course, we adhere to the 1951 Convention on Refugees. Yes, the geography does put us in a, should we say, a far different situation than, say, Bulgaria or countries on the edge of the European Union. But, you know, we do have a humanitarian duty, and we have a proud record. We have a proud record, not least the Huguenots, the Ashkenazi, the Ugandan Asians. We have a long, proud history. But what concerns me about this issue is actually this huge, in biblical proportions, what we're facing now. I mean, over 400,000 people within the last quarter have registered for asylum within the European Union. You know, Germany is now talking about over 1 million people. That is just game-changing. That changes the whole demographics of nation states. And actually, we need to be looking further in the European Union. We can't, with the best will in the world, do more than other parts of the world. We have to ask what the Gulf states are doing. And quite frankly, they're not doing enough of it. So in the Foreign Affairs Committee in Brussels at a committee meeting last month, I challenged the Deputy Speaker of the Saudi Arabian legislative. And it's quite clear that, you know, they're quite happy to sort of talk the talk, but they're not walking the walk. They internationally, when I say internationally, I don't just mean on a European basis. The world has to wake up to this problem, and actually, the world needs to learn from the issues. You know, the tragedy that became Iraq, the tragedy that became Syria, and why were those created in the first place? Well, we know why. And that's because short-sighted, long-term, foreign policy approach.
That's also a debate for another night.
It is.
George, what do you think the shortcomings have been, in particular, of the European responses to the refugee crisis?
Well, I want to pick up on some of the points that Daniel made about if there is no collective response on the part of the EU, you let a few countries or one or two handle the situation, the ones that are closer to the borders of the EU, and then there's an influx that is intractable. So you might think of this as a problem of practicalities. That logistics, as you put it, becomes insurmountable. But you may also think about it in terms of fairness between the EU member states. So the EU is founded on ideas of solidarity and assistance between member states. If one country or two countries or three countries or five countries are doing most of addressing the refugee crisis, this is unfair. It lacks solidarity. So one thing is whether we can deal with the problem one by one. Another thing, whether it is fair to allow a few states to deal with this, insofar as the problems are caused by some internal failures of the system. Now, many people say there's an inadequate framework within the EU. The rule is if you reach the EU, you should apply for asylum and determine refugee status in the first country you enter. Now, this
the Dublin Agreement was suspended, wasn't it?
Exactly, suspended, and for good reason, because it's an outdated framework put in place back in the 90s when we didn't have those problems. And now there are really problems. For example, take Greece. I'm from Greece. So it's not just the point of whether Greece can actually deal with the influx. It's whether the detention conditions and treatment of asylum seekers and refugees meets human rights standards of the European Convention on Human Rights. So the European Court of Human Rights have found that if an EU member state is sending back to Greece asylum seekers to ask for asylum there, that might violate the European Convention of Human Rights because detention standards in Greece fall short of the European Convention threshold. So what I'm saying here is that we have an EU-wide issue which is dealt inadequately by this blanket rule. You send back people to the first point of entry. And given that this gives perverse incentives to refugees, burning their papers when they arrive to Greece so that they're not really registered in Greece. We here have a collective action problem, and for reasons of adequately dealing with the responsibility towards refugees and reasons of fairness of EU member states, this needs to tackle at the collective level. And it's not enough for one state, Germany, to suspend Dublin regulation and accept a number of people. That's very compassionate, that's very generous, but it really has to be dealt at collective level. And I echo Daniel's point of lack of leadership. There is inadequate institutional framework, but so is the case with many other areas of EU law. Right? EU law is an experiment in constitutional design where we work gradually towards solutions, and these solutions at the end of the day have to come at the top-down level, and we're not seeing that now. Right? And I think this is where the problem is. There's inadequate European response. It's not so much with the framework of who is a refugee. There's a very detailed legal criteria for determining status. What we have now here, however, is a framework within the EU that gives perverse incentives to refugees.
But arguably, there are millions of people who would meet the criteria for being regarded as refugees. How realistic is it for laws and policies that the European Parliament might formulate to say, we've done all we can do. At this point, we cannot cope with any more?
So this relates to the main question of this debate about compassion. Okay, so Daniel mentioned fear pitched against compassion. So we, on one hand, we want to do our bit as Europe, as the European Union, towards the refugees. And we feel compassion towards them and try to respond, each one individually as a state, and perhaps at the collective level. But at the same time, there's a fear of losing social cohesion. You mentioned demographics. It's really a fear about identity, cultural identity, fear of terrorism, fear of this and that. And what I don't agree with Daniel on, and this is a last side departure from your point, is this. Compassion can be more powerful than fear. And historically, compassion as an emotion has been a stabilizing one. In the following sense, we as European continent were defined by our response to the Second World War atrocities. So the phrase used in human rights treaties is that these things shocked the conscience of the world, of mankind. Right? And their compassionate responses, emotional responses to suffering, which we think is unjustified, have led us to draft human rights treaties, to set up the European Union, to find ways of supranational cooperation that are beneficial for peace. So what I'm saying here is that we need to think about the refugee crisis as, along those lines of compassion, as an emotional trigger for us to do more. And I don't think we should let fear about how many we can cope. Everybody is entitled to protection. Loss of fear about losing identity, fear about terrorism, fear about cohesion, they are overplayed. And I think compassion as an emotion, backed up by justice, can actually overpower those feelings. So I cannot give you a figure. So how many is enough? I don't think there's such a figure.
Thank you for trying to answer the question, though. It's unusual for me to have that. Thank you. Stephanie, we've heard praise there from George for the compassion that Germany has shown to many, many refugees. How do you think the German history in relatively recent times has influenced the attitude that Angela Merkel has shown towards refugees?
What do you mean with
German history?
Yeah, but what do you mean with recent times?
Well, in the last century.
Okay, so you're not talking about the last recent times. For me, it's a couple of years. Well, obviously, it's actually, I was thinking about what you just said about that compassion actually was the ground on which the European Union was founded, and the Holocaust and the atrocities of what happened during the Third Reich. Well, I'm sure there is that in the German population today, the awareness of where Germany comes from, and which is taught in schools, in every day almost on TV. So you still have documentaries on the Holocaust and on Hitler and so on and so forth. But I think there's another recent history which is very important, and which is when there's all this guessing going on, why did Angela Merkel do what she did? Because this was supposedly a very lonely decision when she left the Dublin Agreement and said we take in any Syrian refugee, and by that violating actually European rules. And she, as most people know, she is East German. She is the daughter of a Protestant vicar, and she lived until she was 27, 28, she lived in GDR, and her biggest dream was always America and the UK, actually. This is also why she is so very engaged now that the UK is not leaving the European Union, because it's so important country to her. And for her, the image of the Hungarians setting up fences again was, no one really knows, but this is what is said that really hit her. And that was something she could not live with, to see walls and fences being built up in Europe again. And so she took those decisions. At the same time, I must say, I mean, I wasn't in Germany at the time, at the end of August, when it really happened. And it was kind of, can you say delirious? Mm. Yeah, it was delirious. It was people, I mean, everybody would go to the station and hold up their posters and want to take people in. And there was just millions of people on the street. And there was this feeling of, maybe you can compare it, don't get me wrong, you can compare it a bit with the 2006 World Cup in Germany, which was the first time Germany could really prove we are a healthy country, we are good people, we are not racist, and everyone loves us. So this was almost a new Germany emerging again, which also on the basis of the Germany is doing very well. Unemployment is on a high low. It's 25 years after the reunification. The Germans managed. And from this came the famous, another sentence of Merkel, which will be historic. She said, "Wir schaffen das. We will manage." In the height of the refugee crisis. And it's something that, it's a positive message. But now, 3 months after, it's hitting reality. And the reality is that now the AfD, which is the, call it right-wing party, is the third strongest party all of a sudden.
You mentioned how lonely the decision was. I just wonder what the impact Angela Merkel's decision has had on her party, on Germany, and Germany's relationship with the EU.
And the European Union.
And the European Union. Of course, the European Union, and understandably, many EU partners were very angry because she broke the rules and she caused a precedent by doing so. And of course, everyone is saying she triggered a pull factor. If she hadn't said there is no upper limit on asylum seekers, and if she hadn't said we will manage, not so many people would have come to Europe. And actually, if you look at it, there is a famous photo, and this will, I mean, so many things of the last months will be, we will look back at that and say, this was a moment, this was another moment. So there was one moment, she went into these kind of reception centers, and she was grabbed by a Syrian or Afghan refugees, and they did a selfie, cheek to cheek, you know? And she's actually a very reserved woman. She doesn't like getting anywhere close to people. And she's smiling, and this Afghan refugee next to her. And boom, this photo was out. It was out there, it was everywhere. And it, of course, the European partners said, you caused this, which is complete nonsense in the end, because why are there so many refugees? Why is the situation in Syria? It's certainly not because Angela Merkel said we manage it.
But she did cause the mass exodus.
She
did. She sent out a very clear message.
How can you rationally
because she sends a clear message. She, you know,
weren't they already coming, Jim?
Yeah, but
because
not.
they're
but
trying
yeah,
to escape from
Martine, they were,
violence
but
back home.
they were, but not in the numbers they were. So you know, that's my point.
But you can never prove that.
Well, I'm sorry. I would say the numbers speak for themselves, and obviously now the political response and the public opinion in Germany. And actually, you know, it just sums up, you know, the huge problem that she has created politically for herself and for her party in Germany. But I wanted to go back to what you said about solidarity, if I could. Solidarity has to be voluntary, and this is a problem. You know, we see the reaction of some of the countries across the European Union, and you cannot, you know, if you want to have solidarity, you have obviously, and compassion, it has to be voluntarily.
But Jim, haven't we in a way, any member state that is already part of the European Union, all 28 of them, have expressed some form of solidarity by deciding to be part of the Union? Yeah,
but they wouldn't. But they, you know, they wouldn't have been a decision on, for example, a common asylum policy would have come through the Commission. It wouldn't, you know, and through the Council. It wouldn't have actually come. It wouldn't have been discussed in national elections at member states. So. This is how Europe is reacting, quite frankly, and I think being reactionary rather than it's being proactive rather than it's being reactive rather than proactive, and this is a huge problem. You have to have, you know, for the way the European Union is changing with regards to numbers, over such a short period of time, and you know yourself from the tragedy facing Greece on the fallout of the collapse of the Greek economy, you know the huge social pressures in Greece at the moment, taking the migrant refugee crisis out of it completely. You know, Greece itself faces huge pressures, and I think that is only going to create further issues. I sit in the European Parliament behind me. I have 3 Golden Dawn MEPs sitting with me now. I'm sorry, you know, I fear that, you know, there will be a rise in the far right again in Greece.
Let's try
me.
to talk about the responses that we've seen so far. Daniel, please come in. But if we can try to think about why has an adequate response across the Union been so elusive?
First, this was exactly why I didn't want to frame the debate in terms of compassion and solidarity, because of this voluntary element. And when we speak about duties, actually it's quite different. Certain things need to be done. And we have to discuss.
Have they? They've been so varied. Why have they been so varied?
I said that partly it's a coordination problem, partly lack of leadership, and they feed into each other. Let's come back to the Merkel decision. I think that in substance, this was the right policy. Well, as the leader of the most powerful and resourceful European country, well, she said, we're going to take the biggest burden. And this was a good act of leadership. Where she probably fell short was that she underestimated or probably overestimated the intelligence of other European leaders and the capacity of their states to react accordingly.
Aren't those leaders, though, Daniel? Aren't they obviously always having to have an eye on the people who put them in power in the first place?
Exactly the point.
They can't act and think that those actions won't be remembered come the next election. They've always got their eye on the ballot box, haven't they?
That's true. And I'll speak about this argument, who's going to benefit politically from what's going on. But let's come back to this point, that Merkel's action, in my opinion, in substance, it was the right course of action, but she should have probably in advance or in another way coordinated, made clear, the intentions, and probably prepared the other governments to act accordingly, because some of them were caught by surprise. Others, simply they used not bona fide this unexpected gesture and policy decision by Merkel, and they started building walls and so on and so forth. But it would have been manageable, actually, and I think Merkel, she had the previous Greek crisis in mind when she again took leadership and came up with a solution. We might discuss whether it was the perfect solution or not, but anyhow the crisis was solved. So probably that was what she was trying to do in an area where the European Union doesn't have settled legal and institutional infrastructure. You need leadership, and she stepped in. But there was some kind of failures, not so much on her side, but on the response that she got from the other leaders. And I'm here particularly disappointed by some of the Eastern European and especially Central European leaders who I think acted quite egoistically against this type of...
I wanted to come to Georgia just very quickly, Stephanie. How let down did she feel? Do we know? By the lack of response, similar response to what Germany was doing in other places, just briefly.
She hasn't commented on that, but obviously she tried to do whatever was possible. So the first thing she would do is get together with François Hollande and try to get the Franco-German engine working. But as you say, that there is only solidarity, there is no duty. She can't force anyone.
George?
I think you're absolutely right that a lot of the decision depends on how governments want to please their voters and what will happen in the next election. So a decision that won't go down very well with the public is not very likely. So if people are worried about immigration and are worried about refugees and are worried about this and that, then the government will have incentives not to show compassion. But that's why I think, Daniel, going back to Daniel, compassion and duties are not mutually exclusive. Right? So there are two ways you can think about this. One is try to have a pre-commitment. So member states could say, we should have a common asylum policy and not allow this for independent member states, and pre-commit ourselves. If you are an EU member state, you're going to be bound by the decisions of the EU. That's one way to do it, but this has downsides. One downside is lack of democratic deficit. So people are, the voters are feel detached from the policies. And there are worries about to what extent the EU is detaching itself from what the people want of every state. The other idea would be to try to win the emotive game, the emotive struggle between fear and compassion. And I'm more optimistic about that. So it's not a good time for Europe now. We've been through a financial crisis, now we have a refugee crisis. You have those reactions, Jim, you are referring to, rise of the extreme right and xenophobia and so on. But when you look at those images of refugees, young boys being washed up in beaches, you have to make the argument on both grounds of duty and compassion. Like, compassion, in a way, is not just an emotion. Compassion is defined as a painful reaction at the suffering of another, which you take to be unjustified. So compassion is not just irrational. It's not just a fear you might have. You may be afraid of spiders. That's irrational. But I think when it comes to compassion, it's a special feeling. It's a feeling whereby you show painful emotion at suffering of others which you think is unjustified. And so long as it's in every European country, in every EU member state, we are making this argument that this is not just painfully emotionally, it's also unjustified, I think we can win this. And then you have the support of governments. And then the voluntary nature you're describing will, I think, become policy.
Jim, I want to ask you, how much greater do you think the responsibility is now towards refugees who are fleeing airstrikes against IS targets? Those countries engaged in those airstrikes, do they not have a greater responsibility to take in refugees who are trying to now get away from that military action?
I think they possibly do.
That includes us.
I think it probably does. I mean, look, we were the first party. Nigel Farage was the first major party leader to call for Syrian refugees to be taken in this country. So don't think, my party isn't compassionate. We are. Some will criticise this. Obviously, we were looking very much at the dimension of the Syrian Christians who have been facing huge problems. And of course, we know Archbishop Welby himself, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has been campaigning on the fact that Syrian Christians are too frightened to go into UN refugee camps, on the border. So,
Are you differentiating then between whether we take in Syrian Christians or
No,
Syrian
I'm certainly not. I'm certainly not. But I'm saying that's what the argument was turned around to. What I'm saying, what I'm concerned about is a large number of single young males who are coming in.
Why does that trouble you?
Because I feel, what are some of them escaping from? We've heard what Islamic States have been saying with regards, saying they will use the refugee crisis, the migrant crisis, as a vehicle to export jihad to the continent of Europe. Regrettably,
haven't we got our own homegrown?
Yes, we have, but regrettably, the tragedy in Paris has, I think, possibly changed President Hollande's approach to how he looks.
But they weren't Syrian, were
no,
they?
but
they were from Europe.
But if you look at it, going back to the political response, what all of us have been saying here, that we've seen the response with Front National. What has happened in last week's provincial elections in France. So, you have to bear in mind, look, I'm a politician, you guys aren't. You have to bear in mind that the politicians will always, be looking at the bigger picture. And you summed that up yourself. It is, how do we get re-elected? And I can't see this being a vote winner. I really, really can't. And actually, you're hearing this actually increasingly, not just from the right. You're hearing this also from centre and from the left across the European Union.
I often think that they don't make you to say marriage vows for the good times. They're there for when it gets a bit tough, I reckon.
Right, yeah.
So in that sense then, we've got tensions within the Union at the moment. What does the refugee crisis tell us, do you think, maybe Stephanie, tell us about the ability of all the members to act in unison in difficult times? Because Germany probably feels like it's been quite let down, I should imagine.
It's pretty disastrous. It's pretty disastrous, because if you think about, I don't know which summit it was now, but there was another emergency summit where they decided to then get through a certain amount of quota, and that was a pretty low number in the end they could agree on. And then a week later, I think it was Slovakia has sued the Commission now to that they will not take these, I think, 700 refugees in, while now officially in Germany it's 1 million refugees this year. So if it's officially 1 million, unofficially it will be far more. So it obviously does not work. And already in the spring there was awareness in Berlin what was going on in Syria and the borders to the southeastern borders of the European Union. And Merkel actually said the refugee crisis will be a far bigger challenge than the euro crisis. So I think Europe is on the brink with this, especially I think, because if you look at the new Polish government, what they are saying, what they are doing. If you look at France, if you look at the Netherlands with the Geert Wilders party, and also if you look at the UK, I think because what is happening in Europe, while we are here on an island, and while the UK has not been very forward-coming, helping in the situation.
It's going about it in a different way.
I mean, the UK is taking 5,000 refugees a year now. This is every night refugees crossing into Germany, 5,000 every night. The UK is taking 5,000 in a year. Anyway, but of course people here, before they take their decision if they vote in or out of the European Union membership, they will look at this crisis as well. So it is far, far bigger, the refugee crisis, than only this. It is also the question whether the UK will remain in the European Union, I think.
Daniel, how much of an existential crisis do you think this is for the EU? If we can't find unity on an issue like this, what does it tell us about other difficult situations that might come down the path?
I think it's a serious crisis, but it is not the real reason for the troubles of Europe. The real reason is that in many countries, you have already formed majorities, which are majorities of fear, majorities which fear that certain rights of theirs are going to be taken away. So these majorities, they have all sorts of politics which are conservative, defensive, protective, and non-cooperative with others.
But why is this
I'll take only
democracy.
I'll take two Eastern European examples. Poland recently and Hungary, actually. These are two countries with clear, protective, conservative majorities of fear. These majorities and their governments, Viktor Orban and now Kaczynski's party and so on, they just took the refugee crisis as an opportunity to express their politics, which was already there. So if it were not for the refugee crisis, they would have found probably other reasons to express the same type of, anti-European, protective and
anti-EU,
so on.
not anti-European, anti-EU.
Stance. So this is a problem which goes a little bit deeper, and I think that the refugee crisis could be a trigger. It puts quite a lot of pressure, and it makes it explicit, but it was already there. We call these parties populist and so on and so forth. They're probably not only present in Eastern Europe. You could probably find them in other countries as well. But once you have such majorities in key European countries, then the European Union becomes a very difficult institutional setting. So it relies on completely other types of attitudes towards cooperation, both at national and supranational level. So this is something that we have to think about, and it's a longer-term problem, actually. It won't disappear with the solving of the problem with the refugees.
George and Jim, how do you think this particular crisis, which is to do with refugees, tests our own commitment to human rights across the EU? You've touched on the Roma community, for example. how does the treatment of refugees within our own borders define the kind of Europe we all want to live in? Jim first, and John.
I think I answered that with my earlier question, so I'm not going to repeat that. But when you say we, are you saying in a nation-state context or in a European Union context?
European Union context.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there can be a unified approach to this because member states, as has been explained, you know, we have democratic elections across the 28 member states, and it is a democratic right to those people, whether people like it or not, is to elect the government they're choosing. So I don't think, you know, you will not get consensus. You know,
And foreign policy is a sovereign matter, isn't it?
Well, at the moment, but of course there are calls in the European Union for a common defence security policy, common foreign defence policy. So you know that is an argument I'm speaking out against all the time. So what's clear is you know the Guy Verhofstadts and the sort of the actually very honest federalists. You know, I don't agree with Guy Verhofstadt, the former Belgian Prime Minister who leads the Audi group in the Liberal Democrat group in the European Parliament, Belgian politician. I don't agree with him, but he's very honest. What he's saying is, you know, we've reached a stage where, you know, we have to decide and, you know, do we go for the unified approach? I mean, you'll probably be amazed to hear that I used to be an SDP activist. I used to leaflet for the old SDP in the old days, you know. But I changed my. The Maastricht Treaty happened for me. You know, I was broadly in favour of a common market, and I looked at the Maastricht Treaty, and I came to the decision that actually, you know, this isn't about a common market anymore. This is about a federal Europe. And people like Verhofstadt are being very honest about that. Roy Jenkins was right. You know, he said there are only two clear positions now with regards to Britain's membership of the European Union: all in or all out. And what I think the member states are trying to do, which we've all alluded to in our responses, is saying we want the good bits, you have the bad bits. Well, actually, the Euro crisis and the migration crisis shows that does not approach. So the 28 member states now are at a position in their history where they have to decide whether they back off completely, as I hope my party advocate, or we go for this wholeheartedly. But you cannot carry on with this selfish approach. You've either got to go for the federal model or back off. But I really do feel that the two pillars, and we hear this from Commissioner Juncker, Timmermans, Mogherini, we hear this in the European Parliament, every plenary session, you know, they call for more Europe, and the people just don't want it. So, you know, we clearly now have to decide.
George, the idea of human rights values, we talk, don't we, about shared values across the member states, freedom, democracy. How do we then remind ourselves of those shared values when it comes to human rights?
Well, I worry about this because it seems to me there's a difference in kind between this crisis and the Euro crisis. So the Euro crisis was an imbalance in the monetary mechanisms put in place and the effect this had on weaker economies. And that, if you like, undermined the project in some economic or financial sense, monetary sense. Here we have an identity crisis about what kind of Europe we want. And if we go back to my point about the whole initiative to set up a Europe and address some problems collectively was informed by ideas of human rights and individual dignity, was informed by the need to promote peace and stability and toleration and those liberal values. And it seems to me that if we now turn away from them, even if it is on the narrow point of refugee policy and asylum policy, we are undermining our own commitment as member states to those values. And that to me is very worrying. I think we will muddle through because there are difficult times. I think eventually we will overcome these fears. EU has always been a pendulum from, you know, more tendency to integration to more sovereignty, statist tensions. But it seems to me that this one is more special. And I think we have to be very careful about having a very negative or inadequate reaction to the refugee crisis, because this will soon lead to voices at domestic level showing less and less respect, not only to how we treat foreigners and others, but how we treat our own people within every nation state. So I don't see the two being detached at all. I think the values of human rights are universal. You can't just pay lip service and say, oh, we only care about the well-being of people who happen to have been born in this country or happen to have a right to live in this country. And then everything else, we have to look at it differently, through a different prism. And then those fears become aggravated. I think this is an identity crisis for Europe, but I'm optimistic we will muddle through.
Let's talk about how we maybe do things better next time. How flawed an idea, Jim, is the Schengen area? I mean, obviously the UK has an opt-out of Schengen. But we've seen that in times of national emergency, countries can still, despite the Schengen agreement, close their borders, can't they? I mean, France did it after the Paris attacks, which we understand.
But the trouble with that, Martine, is it actually breaks the whole concept of what Schengen is about. So it's not really Schengen. You know, it's shown it cannot work. It's shown that free movement as a core principle does not work because of the response.
Well, surely what we're talking about freedom of movement of individuals who are EU citizens.
Yes.
This was about, in the France case, it was because there had been a national emergency. Paris had been attacked. That was why they closed the borders. Hungary closed the borders because they felt that they just couldn't cope anymore, didn't they? So there are extreme reasons for it.
Yeah, but if you hear the criticism in the European Parliament, in the European institutions, who aren't interested in the nation states, they're interested in the concept of a European Union. If you hear that response, I think all you're doing is just creating further tensions and actually bringing in the end date of the European Union even nearer.
Daniel, you wrote recently about the need for compassion and some of the arguments that people make against taking refugees, and you touched on the collective consciousness of Bulgaria in how it has treated people in danger. At times it's done something you might regard as compassionate, and at other times it hasn't. What impact does that have on the national identity?
Well, I used this example of the Bulgarian treatment of Jews during the Second World War. And Bulgaria, rightly prides itself with the salvation of 50,000 Jews from its territory, but there are 11,000 in unoccupied territories in Greece, in Macedonia, which were sent to the death camps. And the Bulgarian government did nothing, or not enough actually, to prevent this. And it turned out that it was possible because afterwards, for the larger group of Jews, salvation was definitely possible. So this is the moral tally. And
which of those actions, the ones where the government came to people's aid and didn't come to people's aid, is playing out more now, is having a greater bearing on Bulgaria's reaction?
Well, I'm not sure that such memories are decisive for the present crisis, and that's why when even we were trying to explain Angela Merkel's decisions, I don't believe that all these decisions they stem from what happened 40 or 50 years ago. So yes, these things do matter; they're important, but they're not always the key decisive factor. And here I want to come back a little bit to Europe and what we have to do in the present circumstances. And
what needs to change then?
I just pose the question: is it so difficult actually to come up with the following policies, coordinated and common, kind of defense and protection of the external borders of the Union?
Well, that's what the efforts are being made to try to do that.
How difficult is
very
that?
Difficult. Very difficult.
That to achieve.
Difficult?
Well,
and why is it so difficult? Actually, all these countries, they have, I think most of them, they have sufficient capacities. Some of them, they need help here and there. So again, it's a matter of coordination and political will. Second, how difficult it is to have a really common system of registration of migrants, refugees, and so on, and a manageable instrument of sharing the burden among the countries for hosting these people. So all of them, all of the Syrians, if they decide to come, there will be 10 million. So Europe is over 500 million. What kind of social problem we are talking about? So,
Well,
some people are saying that,
would say, Daniel, that there are
well, of course, if these 10 million come to Bulgaria, Bulgaria is 7 million, and it will be a huge problem. But if they, but if these 10 million they're spread around Europe, nobody will notice them. And actually, I'm amazed. Countries like Poland, extremely successful in the economic crisis, 40 million people. An example of development of Eastern Europe, and they don't want a single refugee. So
that goes back to my point, because the example.
But I don't think that this is democracy.
But the example you gave, but it goes. That is my point exactly. You know, the laudable example you gave of the Bulgarian rescue of 50,000 Jewish people in the Second World War. People forget that at the end of the show, after the war had finished, upon their return to Poland, 3,000 Polish Jews were murdered by Polish people. So
tell us about the difficulties in protecting the external borders.
So that highlights.
Tell us about the
highlights
difficulties.
National differences again. The differences, of course, is that people have a different approach. My wife is Irish. You know, we have Ireland, we have Sweden, we have Austria, who are traditionally neutral countries. Very different to France, United Kingdom, of course, to seats on the permanent seats on the Security Council. Very different approach. So if we have a common defence, common security approach, you're actually challenging the neutrality of those three member states. So, you know, this is why people have to accept the European Union is so very different. And do you know what? I think that is actually the great strength of the European Union, is its diversity. By trying to homogenise us, harmonise us and pasteurise us, actually leads to more problems, I really believe, in the long run, as we are starting to see.
Stephanie, what kind of changes are you getting the sense that the German government, Angela Merkel in particular, wants to see so that we don't end up in this position again, where she's trying to lead in one way and other countries are reacting differently?
No, on the German level or on the European level?
On the European level, but the German view.
Well,
of
first
what
of all,
needs to
she now has to manage the situation in Germany, obviously. And you and at the very beginning, you asked about. We were talking about duties and compassion, but also the question: when have we fulfilled our duties? So she is now trying to somehow convince Germans that the government will find a way to stop the influx of refugees. So actually in the last weeks you've seen quite sharp measures. For example, they've announced that there will no be any more family reunification, that everyone has to register, that the checking of everyone who's arriving will be far more thorough. Also that taking people back to their country of origin will be the process will be much quicker. So this is what is happening now, because she also looks at the polls, and the polls clearly show that she is slumped. I mean, she was at almost 80% a year ago, and now she's less than 50%. And what I said before, that this right-wing party is now at 10 or 11%. Plus, she has there's a party conference this weekend, and the party wants really to push her towards saying, yes, there is an upper limit of asylum seekers, which actually, according to the German constitution, there's not. The German constitution says clearly, anyone who has the right to be protected from any atrocities in the country where he or she comes from has a right for asylum in Germany. So this is an absolute, it's a terrible dilemma where the German government is in now.
And actually, sorry to interrupt, but how can any country have an upper limit? Because under the 51 Convention for Human Rights, we have a legal obligation. So we don't know, God forbid, what's around the corner if some tsunami comes across the continent, and there's huge relocation needed. God only knows what's around the corner. So you can't actually, aside of the legal implications, you can't actually morally do that, because we don't know what's around the corner.
George, what do you think needs to change to make sure that the European Union is better equipped to respond to whatever might be coming next?
Well, we talked a lot about how processing the claims of refugees can be more of a collective issue, and the border control and all of that. But we didn't talk at all about what the EU can do away from the borders, away from the EU. So
Do you mean try to deal with the crisis back home
back
on the
home.
borders of Syria?
Exactly.
We've seen, obviously, haven't we, the talks recently with Turkey, €3 billion being given to Turkey to help with the coping with the number of refugees that they're dealing with.
So I think there are long-term things and short-term things. Long-term, of course, try to help put an end to those crises over there. Short-term is making sure that the refugees who are in neighbouring countries, perhaps they can be processed there, perhaps there can be agreement at some collective level to process refugee applications from those neighbouring countries, as opposed to giving them incentives to have to do this trip all the way from Syria, through Turkey, through Greece, through Bulgaria and Hungary, all the way to Germany and Sweden. And this is what the current system allows, or makes it, gives an incentive to do. And I think we really have to, that's the first point, like making sure whatever we do this collectively, and we take away incentives that actually jeopardize the lives of those people, like their incentives to have to travel all the way from Syria and risk being drowned in the Mediterranean in the way for seeking refuge. So it sounds to me to be an absolute priority. Like, this cannot go on. You cannot go on having a system of rules, a framework for refugee applications, what it incentivizes this kind of risk-taking and life-risking journeys from that region all the way here.
But please, Jules, with respect, let's not just focus on the Mediterranean. We had a chat last night on the phone. What nobody speaks about, and this makes me really angry, is how nobody talks about the thousands of people who die crossing the Sahara Desert. That's completely forgotten about. I don't know why. Is it, well, because they're Africans, they don't matter, I don't know. You know, everybody seems to be focused on the Middle East dimension here. But thousands of people have died trying to cross the Sahara as well. But
maybe it's because they're still in Africa when they die because of that journey.
Well, you know,
and we don't get to hear about it as much,
but we should be hearing about it, because, you know, the crisis is actually coming in two directions. It's coming from the Middle East, and you know, I mean, I'm doing a lot of work on the Horn of Africa, specifically with Somaliland. But you know, we also have this other problem with people sort of coming up, you know, from Chad, Niger, northern Nigeria, coming across the Sahara, but nobody pays any attention to that.
Let's have some questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, we've got some roving microphones which will be brought to you, so you don't need to shout. If you could just raise your hand, tell us who you are, if you're representing a particular organisation, and if there's a particular panellist that you'd like to ask the question of. There's a gentleman there, I think, has got the microphone already, and another man with his hand up there. Yes.
Andrew Keckwick. How deep does the new German compassion run and will endure for? Ignoring the 20th century, Germany did not offer Gastarbeiter citizenship until the 21st century, and it didn't make the sort of attempts to integrate communities that Britain and France have done.
Sorry, I didn't get the whole question.
How deep is the compassion in Germany, given the fact that it hasn't made the efforts that, say, France and Britain have made to integrate
okay,
people?
yeah, that's a good question. You're right. I mean, after the Second World War, well, in actually around from the end of, before the war ended until, say, 1947, there were around 12 to 14 million German displaced. So Germany has experienced huge refugees movement, and they were integrated, but of course it was a very difficult integration of Germans within Germany, and is still until today a problem, especially with neighboring Poland. But then I guess you're more talking about immigrants coming from Turkey, which was the so-called Gastarbeiter, and you're absolutely right. There has been over decades no integration, not so much with the first generation, but especially the second generation, and this has created a lot of tensions, and the term Gastarbeiter says the concept is you come here, you work, it's fine, get your money, but then please go back. And this is why now this is also playing into the current very difficult situation. I mean, last week I think there was a TV program on prime time which was about, is the Islam compatible with democracy? And of course, one of the big questions is also the role of the woman. There have been a lot of reports. For example, there was this one report which caused an outcry of a female real estate manager who went showed a Syrian family an apartment, and the head of the family said, "No, you can't show me the apartment. You're a woman." So this is now causing a lot of trouble. I'm not giving any judgment about this. I'm just describing the situation and what Germany is now going through, because they never really wanted to look at the Turkish huge population. About 1 million Turks live in Germany out of 80 million. That's quite a big proportion. But it's always been something which we call a parallel society, which the government has not looked much at. So in Germany, it's still like exotic if a Turkish-born politician becomes the leader of a party. While here, I mean, you have from everywhere, anyone is politician or in officials. It's still Germany is a very monoethnic society still in this sense. Yeah.
Many people think Britain's still got a long way to go. Gentleman there.
I've got quite a few questions.
Could you just ask one? Because for now,
Very quick question for Stephanie then. What does the left, in the shape of Sarah Wagenknecht, think about the problem? What's she saying about the problem at the moment?
You mean the Linkspartei, the left
Yes.
party, where, in terms of the refugees or in terms of Syria?
In terms of both, yes.
Both. Well, the left party obviously says we have to welcome all the refugees, and she also says at the same time, or the party says, we may not interfere in Syria and we should not participate. So the Bundestag, the parliament, voted last Friday in favour of military intervention, so the Germans are not participating in any combat or airstrikes or whatever. Yeah.
I'll come back to you if we've got time. Yes.
You spoke earlier about each European Union member to take their fair share of the refugees. I think it was Daniel talking about that. I'd like to get the panel's view on whether they think it should actually be limited to European Union. How about the US? How about outside European Union?
Should it be limited, the quota idea, George?
Of course not. I mean, every state should do the fair bit, assuming they have the capacity and ability to do so. So I wouldn't like to limit it to the EU. We're talking about the EU because there are issues specifically to do with the EU that are related to this crisis. But it is a collective responsibility problem, right? All the nations that can provide refuge to those people have a duty. Now, the problem is, how do you coordinate that, right? It's easy in the EU because we have a project of integration and institutions and leaders and so on. It's less difficult. It's more difficult with other parts of the world where there isn't that. But you're right, absolutely right. Now, in conditions of uncertainty about who does what, every state may be thinking, well, if other states are not doing anything, why should I do something, right? And then you may have an attitude of fear coupled by a sense of unfairness. Why should I take more refugees than other states when they're doing something? And to break out of this vicious circle is for a lot of states to come together and have some salient means of providing assistance. And I think the EU can do that. So the reason for focusing on the EU is because you have their mechanisms for getting a lot of states to help out. And I think the more states help out, the more other states will feel they have a duty. But when no state does anything, then you have these attitudes.
Doesn't the quota idea break down, though, if you think that someone is allocated to go to country A and they want to go to country B? And once they're inside the European Union because of Schengen, they can move anyway.
When they've got a passport, they don't live anywhere.
Well, this idea of burden sharing, it could take various forms. So quota is one example, but the resources and so on could be another. So if it doesn't work through quotas, it could be through payments and so on. But I think burden sharing is essential. And just one point, I agree that other countries should be involved.
Exactly.
But the lack of involvement of other countries shouldn't be used as an excuse for the European Union not to do anything. And in my country and in Eastern Europe, this is a popular argument, actually. We should leave this to the Americans because, well, they initiated the whole thing in the Middle East, and now they should bear the burden. So this is, I think, a wrong argument, and it should be avoided.
I'll only be compassionate when you're compassionate. Doesn't really work like that, does it? Jim, you were going to say the idea of contributions being made in other ways. We had the Valletta Summit in November, which brought together 60 European and African nations, and it was a mixture of sticks and carrots, wasn't it?
And as was the 3 billion
to
payment
Turkey.
to Turkey.
But
and
it's
of
like a
course
trust
they've got-
fund, isn't it, to
they've
try
got-
and help African governments take migrants back.
Yeah, but
That's another way of doing it,
course,
isn't it?
but you know, the way to take it back is actually through trade and not aid. By actually, for example, we have huge tariff imports on African countries on agriculture producing. So surely, if we can take away those tariffs and actually let those countries have pride and let them actually trade their way forward, and actually make it far more attractive for citizens within that country to actually stay in that country and help to make that country a success. That's got to be the way to be going. But I've got to disagree with you, not surprisingly, on the issue. No, we need the European Union. You know, only the European Union can do this. Well, there's the United Nations as well. The United Nations need to be looking at this as well. And of course, the Valletta Summit was a lot of the Gulf states were conspicuous by their absence. So this very much does need a global approach. With the best will in the world, yes, of course, as I said at the beginning, we do all want to wave. You know, it's not a human being or a sensible, moderate, compassionate human being who doesn't want a happy conclusion to this tragedy. But you know, the globe has to wake up to this. You cannot expect, you know, and actually, even if this was physically happening on the other side of the world, you couldn't expect that block of nations on that side of the world to have to deal with it. It has to be a global approach. It just happens to be, but this is actually on the borders of the European Union, so it affects us in a far more conscious way. But, you know, there has to be a global approach. Of course there does. And there has to be a global approach to actually sorting out the problems within Syria, within Iraq, you know, within the Middle East, dealing with radicalisation and fundamentalism, and actually allowing people to want to return to their home countries.
Gentleman there, is there a microphone? And then there's a question here on the front row.
Thanks very much. Quentin Peel, Chatham House. I'd like to ask the non-British panellists whether... I'd like to come back really, Martin, to your original question, which was about the apparent differences in compassion that was being shown across Europe.
Nobody's keen on this compassion word.
Yes.
Quentin.
Well, I'm interested. We've talked about the East European question, but to what extent is the British response been perceived as being significantly less compassionate towards the refugees than other member states? And I'd like to ask Jim, I'm very interested at the distinction that you've made very clear tonight between your attitude to inner EU migration, which clearly you want to stop freedom of mobility, and apparently a much more open attitude towards refugees. So would you regard Cameron's numbers of we'll take 20,000 over 4 years as being enough to deal with the problem? For example, Ireland is taking in 4,000 in 2 years. If we took the same proportion to our population, I think we'd be talking about 70,000 in Britain. I was in Germany recently and I asked Germans what they thought really would be fair for the British to take in, and they said 200,000 in 1 year.
Right, quickly then, a Bulgarian, German and Greek perspective on how Britain's compassion levels compare. Just briefly, if you would.
I'm afraid that public opinion in Bulgaria doesn't have a firm view on the British approach, so it's not so central to us for one reason or another. But in fact, Bulgaria was one of the countries which didn't side with the Central European states like Hungary and Poland, and we agreed with the quota decision. And this is so because we anyhow have more refugees than our quota. So this is generally the attitude, and I wouldn't call it extremely compassionate.
No particular view. What about the German view of Britain?
The German view is there was a lot of disappointment and almost shock. I mean, there was a lot of comments saying...
That's a very diplomatic word to use, isn't it? Disappointment.
Disappointment. Then I said shock, because everyone knows that actually the UK is the cradle of refugees. I mean, Jews and from all over the world. Britain has a strong tradition of taking in people that are trying to escape suffering somewhere else in the world. So, and then there was this strong feeling that this is very much driven by domestic interests, and it's driven by an upcoming referendum on the European Union membership. And so I remember on September 3rd, Cameron did this U-turn and suddenly said, because the photo of Aylan Kurdi was also here everywhere, and said, yeah, we're taking refugees in, but only from the refugee camps, where that didn't help Germans or Austrians faced with 10,000 of
But
refugees.
Germany and Austria could have done that too. They could have said, right, you need to stop.
How? How?
By sending a
Send
message.
them back.
Send them back.
Sending a message.
How do you send people back that are literally on your doorstep? How do you send them back? Do you put them in a... I mean, we had
But
this
they could have sent the message,
70 years ago. Sorry?
That from now on, we will be bringing them from the
I
camps.
do agree that certainly
It would-
I'm not the
it-
government, so
if that message-
I'm not
You're not.
having to defend the German government.
If that message had been sent, there wouldn't be 5,000 people arriving every day. So, you know,
You don't know that.
I'm
You
sorry.
don't know
Well,
that.
they might be arriving here, but we're an island, so it's a bit more difficult for them to get to us. Do you have your finger on the Greek pulse of
Well, I'm
how
going
they...
to disappoint our member of the audience. I have no sense what the perception in Greece is. I've lived here for 20. I've lived here for 20 years, so I can only speak of the
So you're
perception.
British. You're British then.
What
Yeah, I am British.
do you think of the British response then?
Well, compassion as a feeling is difficult to quantify. So what is compassionate enough? So Daniel's point initially was, like, you know, we have to talk about duties, right? And what duties is the UK complying with the duties to do its fair bit? And I say no, because the numbers are too low given the capacity of the UK. And if you see this in the light of the broader views on immigration of the government, then I wouldn't say just there's little compassion. I'd say there's no compassion, because the constant fear of what immigration might do in this country is not supported by evidence of the numbers of people who are here and the difficulties that they put on the system. So the number given by David Cameron and what is proposed to be done on this, it seems to me totally inadequate. So if we judge compassion in those terms, I'd say is hardly anywhere near what it's supposed to be.
And the second part of the question was, is 20,000 enough, Jim?
You can't, Quinton. You can't put a figure on it because it, you know, circumstances change. You know, we do have a huge issue. You know, with the increase in net migration to the UK, you know, over the past few years, no one can deny the pressures that it's put on our public services. We've got over 1 million people on the housing list at the moment. You know, so the Prime Minister finds himself in a very difficult situation. But the principle, I go back to what I said earlier about the 51 Convention. We have a humanitarian obligation. Of course we do. You know, if we didn't, I wouldn't be sitting here today. If we hadn't exercised that many years ago, you know, my grandfather wouldn't be here, so I wouldn't be here. So, and the danger is, it's very easy, you know, with respect for the media, to grab on another.
Don't just show them any respect at all.
No. But you know, the media will, you know, you're doing your job. You will look at a number and you're grabbing that number. So you can't grab on numbers because circumstances change. But certainly, of course, the principle, and I support, and my party supports the principle of the 51 Convention of offering support. I hope that answers.
Question here.
Okay, thank you. My name is Gijs Kleter. I'm from the Netherlands, from a small town called Wageningen, very international because of its university. And the funny thing is that at this very moment, my municipality is organizing an information evening because of the arrival of new refugees in my town and the accommodation. My question is actually completely different. So far, we haven't heard any of the panelists about the issue of human trafficking, people who apparently make a business out of this, organized crime organizations, actually pulling in people. Shouldn't this also be part of a strategy in order to actually prevent people coming to Europe and also the exploitation of such people? Because apparently there are also other issues involved, like, people being used as illegal workforce and some other nasty examples. I'm just wondering if this should not be a kind of holistic approach.
One of the reasons that David Cameron said that he wanted to take refugees from the camps was so that the people traffickers were cut out of the equation. So that was one of his arguments. George?
Well, yeah, that goes back to the point I made earlier about trying to have a structure whereby you don't give incentives to people to have to be at the mercy of those traffickers and also risk their lives in the course of that journey. But so long as this is happening, we have to deal with them when they come in the European member state. Now, what can be done to avoid that? So, for me, it's not just the danger of the being trafficked and being at the mercy of these criminals, is also that these things cost money. So we know, if you read the stories of these refugees, you know exactly how much money they spend, and they pay different people and so on. And my worry as well is that we don't have a structure or a practice whereby people who have that money can embark on the journey, and those who don't are treated in a way, end up having a worse fate because they're going to begin that journey, right? So there are issues there, and I think we need to look at what we can do in the camps, but that shouldn't be mutually exclusive. It's not either the camps or we do everything back home. It has to be both. Now, whether you can crack down on traffickers operating in Turkey and the Syrian borders and so on, I think it's really hard. So long as wherever there's human suffering, there will be people trying to exploit it. So what other countries can do for trafficking within Turkey on the borders around Syria, it seems to me very difficult to say what they can do, other than just call for cracking down on traffickers and relying on the political will of the country in question.
And I agree with you that this should be taken on board and considered very seriously. My only concern is that not all people who are involved in helping in one way or another refugees to cross the countries are part of organized crime. So simply, there are people coming, they need transport, and they're ready to pay a lot of money for that. And informal market is being created, and all sorts of people get involved in that. Yes, some of them are mafia guys, organized crime, and so on. But sometimes it's just normal, ordinary.
I mean, in the end, it comes down, of course, to the countries where this is actually happening. So Turkey, or take, for example, Libya. And Libya is a completely dysfunctional state. So how, because it's actually the border guards who are the human traffickers, or the coast guards. So if you have these kind of countries, it's for us Europeans very difficult to say we crack down on this if you don't have a honest cooperation with these countries of origin, I guess.
Just clarify one detail, is that possible? Okay. Well, when it comes to organized crime, it was just one detail I mentioned. Apparently, there's some kind of collusion, for instance, with the Italian mafia. When we still had this issue of the African refugees, apparently there was a whole scheme, a network, even companies working for organized crime setting up camps, so they even profited from the whole business. So.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Jim.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. Yes, there will be people, actors, shall we say, players, earning money on the back of what you said. So, taking an opportunity. But by and large, this isn't some spiv on a street corner saying, "Here, mate, I've got space on a boat. Give us €3,000." This is serious organised crime. It is a mafia, and it is also terrorist organisations. There are very real concerns in security. Intelligence areas that some of these camps are actually being run by Islamic State. We've heard what's been said about Christians not being safe in some of these camps. So it does actually go wider. So perversely, some of this money that these poor people are paying is actually being fed back into far sinister organisations. And that was one of the reasons why my party sent a very, very early message when calling for the boats to be sent back. Now, that may have sounded extremely callous at the time, but we followed the example of what Prime Minister John Howard did in Australia, sending a very clear message. And yes, I know that doesn't take care of the people routes, the land routes where people.
It's also been massively controversial.
It has been controversial, but if you look at the final effect, lives were saved. And the smugglers realised that their assets were being seized, they were losing their boats, and so consequently, they were at an advantage because there wasn't the land route that there is. But it sent a very clear message very early on. I feel if we've been a bit stronger on that, but I do worry. I think a blind eye is being turned, certainly by some elements of Turkish authorities, with regards to what is happening with regards
Maybe
to.
maybe the Turks will change that now. They feel they've
I'm
got
not
some
convinced.
support from the European
I'm
Union.
not
I want to
convinced
ask just very quick. Do you want to add something
Well,
very quickly? Then what two more
just
very
gonna
quick
say
questions?
this is controversial, and the idea that we are going to send a message to the criminal organization by using people on a boat at mid-sea as a means to send a message, that to me seems very, very wrong. That if you have someone whose life is at risk and you send away the boat just to give a message to the criminal organizations, there must be other ways to stop them operating. And we cannot use people on a boat as a means to send a message to organizations. That to me sounds really wrong.
Well, I'm sorry. History has shown the approach. It's worked.
It might work.
It
but
might
it's
stop
wrong.
it. But George, once that route is stopped, then it allows resources to be concentrated in other areas.
That's the whole point of human rights, not to use people as a means to an end, even if that end is worthy. We have to treat them with dignity, person by
Yes,
person,
we do.
person by person.
We do, and we do.
I want to
No,
take two
we do. But
I want to take
if
two more questions, Jim.
if those boats had been stopped, Alan Kurdi wouldn't have drowned in the sea, quite frankly. If a message had been sent, and the people who were using those vehicles, if word got back to them that there was a chance that boat would be stopped and turned around, they wouldn't be spending the money in the first place or working, for 2 or 3 months
Jim,
to get a
I want
place on that boat in the first place. It would be sending a message.
I've got two more questions, I'm
Supply and
afraid,
demand.
and then we need to stop because I should be in trouble for overrunning. Sorry, this lady here and then here.
My name is Özlem Okuyucu. I'm from Turkey. I would like to ask that in Turkey-EU accession negotiations, Chapter 24, Justice, Freedom and Security, cannot be open to negotiations for years because it is a blocked chapter and it is of direct relevance to the refugee crisis. And I would like to ask that, do you think that the opening of this chapter will facilitate the cooperation in this matter? And what should the EU do in this respect for the opening of this chapter?
Accession.
I'm opposed to Turkish accession to the European Union. I think Turkey has huge problems. I think, quite frankly, I'll say something controversial. Kemal Ataturk must be turning in his grave. It is what is happening with President Erdogan is becoming an increasingly less secular country. Actually, the continental landmass of Turkey, 97% of Turkey is in Asia. She is not suitable for membership of the European Union. And I think, from what is being said by many Turkish citizens, and I go on holiday to Turkey, I have Turkish friends, what is being said.
Some of my best friends are Turks.
Yeah. I should have started by saying Nasser. We have to accept that Turkey is not suited, quite frankly, to a European Union, quite frankly, who, if she does join, a European Union whose borders will extend to Syria and Iraq. And I don't think that is acceptable. Because the European Union is all about enlargement. I'm going to say this, but my belief the European Union is about creating another superpower called the European Union. The bigger the better as far as they're concerned.
Just briefly. I think in the very beginning, the accession process was very good for Turkey. Whether the end is that really Turkey will join the European Union one day or not, that doesn't matter for the time being. But it has improved a lot of things in Turkey in the beginning. But now, if you look at the policies of Erdogan, if you see what they've been doing just ahead of the last elections, cracking down on newspapers. There are so many journalists in jail. It's a terrible situation in Turkey. And now, on top of this, Europe is dependent on Erdogan. So it is now a very, very tricky situation because the European Union needs the Erdogan government to cooperate, but cannot really criticize anymore what's going on in the country. So I think it's a disastrous situation.
Sorry, just one very quick point. The Turkish treatment, we've spoken about freedom of press, but actually their approach to the Kurdish minority, and it's the Kurds who have actually done more than any in that region to actually protect the secular identity of certain parts of Iraq. And quite frankly, their approach to the Kurds are despicable.
Need to be quick.
From the experience of Eastern Europe, pre-accession negotiations have been very positive for the countries in the region, and they have helped a lot for strengthening human rights and so on. But I agree with the colleagues on the panel that there are pressing and serious issues now in Turkey which need to be specifically addressed. In general, I believe also in the positive outcomes from negotiations, soft power by the EU, pressure on different countries to change.
Final question.
I just wanted to ask about, you all talked about governments acting kind of on behalf of their people and that putting ballots in the box. But why do you think that possibly people aren't being compassionate? And if that's because of the way that refugees are portrayed as a burden in the press, possibly.
Do you mean people as in the public? Or
Yeah, as in
our politicians? As
in the public. If the public being compassionate enough, and if not, is that because of the problem with the way that refugees are presented to us by our governments in conversation on the TV and the newspapers?
George, just very quickly, whoever would like to answer. Just
well,
briefly.
it's a very good question, and I don't have a clear answer other than saying that the instinct of fear is always with us. So fear about identity of your culture, fear about terrorism, fear about influx of immigration and so on. So these are fears the public always has, and depending on the context, they become greater or diminished. Compassion, on the other hand, also has a very basic instinct in the public. I think if you look at the debate about whether to publish that photograph, I think it was very telling. And a lot of the arguments was, well, look, we have to be able to see those images and trigger those feelings that will help us give the appropriate response as a matter of policy. So I do think these things pull against different directions, fear and compassion, like Daniel said. Now, is the public more prone to the fear than the compassion? That I doubt. So I do sense if there's more fear than compassion, there's something wrong about our culture.
Yeah, quickly.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of compassion now. I just think the pressures on society are far different now. Maybe it's consumerism, I don't know. That's sort of quite a deep, different area to be going. But I think society, has changed a lot. But the compassion is still there. But it's very. I mean, in 1956, my grandmother took in a family of Hungarian refugees who escaped the revolution. But of course, that was only a few years after the Second World War. So I think, the response, obviously, to just speaking about the German response to refugees within Germany, people would have been very aware of that, very much so. But I think we haven't really faced a serious refugee crisis like this, thankfully, in our lifetime. So I think people are concerned about it, but I think it comes down to public services, the pressures, the problems people have sort of living their lives on a day-to-day basis. I think it's far harder now because of people are used to having so much more than they had, say, in 1956. So I think it's because the world has moved on and become far more technocratical than it was many years ago.
Just briefly, Stephanie.
Well, if you look at the German case, if you think of the people, if you would call they have a lack of compassion because they are very critical of refugees coming in. So if you look at the voters of the AfD, this more right-wing party, it is mainly people in Eastern Germany. It is male. It is people without work, and it's people in general who have this fear that something is taken away from them because anyway they feel quite lost in the world they're living in.
Well, part of the reason is that there are more and more parties which intentionally instrumentalize such fears for political purposes, and they inflate them, and they actually generate kind of additional fears and so on and so forth. And this is, I think, a dangerous momentum. Karl Loewenstein in 1937 described fascism as emotionalism, as such negative emotionalism. And I think we are moving a little bit to such type of politics. And just on one argument, which I don't think it's misleading, because many people say, we fear that such parties are gaining support. So in order to prevent this, we need to do what they want. Let's say build a wall or something like that. But in fact, in this way, we are making the mainstream parties accepting exactly the same fears which are instrumentalized by these parties that we allegedly don't want to come to power. So this type of negative dynamics also, I guess, is responsible for the situation in which, unfortunately, fears trump compassion in many places.
thank you for your questions. If you have any more pressing ones, I'm sure you can ask them outside. We've reached the end of the event, but usually there's some refreshment outside. Yes, Dominic's nodding. On behalf of the European Parliament UK Information Office and UCL European Institute, I'd like to thank our panellists for appearing this afternoon. Thank you. And thank you to you for attending. I hope we'll see you back here at Europe House very soon. Thank you.